We always thought we'd be safe if we reached the stars. If we could escape the confines of Earth, we could leave behind the wars, the pestilence, and the hatred. The Ark was supposed to be our salvation. Instead, it became our tomb. I remember the final days on Earth vividly. The sky, a boiling mass of smoke and ash, choked the sun into a sickly haze. We were losing, and everyone knew it. The enemy, faceless and merciless, drove us to the brink. Cities crumbled and entire continents burned. There was nothing left to fight for but survival. The Ark was a colossal construct, an amalgamation of Earth's last technological marvels. They packed us in like sardines, promising safety in the vastness of space. Thousands of us crammed into steel coffins, whispering prayers to gods that had long since abandoned us. We had no choice but to believe in the illusion of salvation. The corridors of the Ark are a labyrinth of shadows and stale air. The sound of the engines, once a comforting reminder of our escape, now feels like the pulse of a dying beast. We thought we'd left the worst behind on Earth. But the Ark had other plans. Factions formed quickly. Humans are predictable in their desperation. The strong preyed on the weak, and alliances shifted like sand in a storm. The bridge crew tried to maintain order, but their authority was a joke. We were left to fend for ourselves, to fight for scraps and cling to whatever semblance of power we could muster. Then came the virus. It started as a whisper, a rumor in the lower decks. People falling ill, bodies mutating, minds unraveling. At first we thought it was just another obstacle to overcome, another test of our resilience. But it spread faster than we could contain it, turning friends and family into ravenous monsters. I'm part of a small group trying to make sense of the chaos. We scavenged what we could, armed ourselves with weapons, and stuck to the shadows. There's Gregor, a former soldier with a haunted look in his eyes. Lila, a medic who lost her faith in medicine long ago, and Dex, a tech genius who sees patterns in the madness. We're not heroes, just survivors clinging to the hope that somewhere in this floating nightmare lies a way out. The Ark holds secrets, dark ones, whispers of experiments, hidden labs, and things best left forgotten. We need to find answers before the virus takes us all. The truth is out there, buried in the steel and blood of this forsaken vessel, and we will uncover it or die trying. Gregor wiped the blood from his knife, smearing it on the torn fabric of his pants. The thing that used to be a person lay twitching at our feet, its face twisted into an expression of perpetual hunger. Lila knelt beside it, her hands shaking as she checked for any signs of humanity. She found none. "Don't bother," I said. "It's gone." She glanced up at me, her eyes hollow. "I know, but I have to try." Dex stood by the doorway, his eyes darting back and forth. "We need to move," he urged. "This place isn't safe." He was right. The screams from deeper within the ship were getting louder, closer. We couldn't stay here. I looked around the small room, a storage closet filled with broken tools and discarded supplies. We had to find a better place, somewhere we could regroup and figure out our next move. "We need to get to the command deck," Gregor said, his voice steady despite the chaos around us. "There might be answers there." "Or more death," Lila muttered. "Both, probably," I replied. We gathered what we could, scavenged weapons, a few ration packs, a medkit that was barely stocked, and slipped out into the corridor. As we moved, the walls seemed to close in on us, the metal groaning under the strain of its own weight. We stepped over bodies, some human, some not. The virus had done its work, transforming flesh into something out of a nightmare. "Stay close," Gregor ordered, "and keep quiet." We crept forward, every step a test of our resolve. The ship's layout was a maze, designed to confuse and disorient. But Dex had a knack for navigation, his fingers tracing invisible maps in the air as he led us through the winding passages. We turned a corner and came face to face with a group of survivors. They looked as ragged as we did, eyes wide with terror. For a moment, we just stared at each other, a silent understanding passing between us. Then, One of them stepped forward. A man with a scar running down the side of his face. "You're heading to the command deck?" he asked, his voice rough and cracked. "Yes," Gregor replied. "We think there might be answers there." "Good luck," the man said. "You'll need it." He stepped aside, allowing us to pass. Behind us I heard the survivors muttering to each other, their voices filled with desperation. They wouldn't last long. I knew that much. But we couldn't save everyone. Hell, we couldn't even save ourselves. We approached the command deck. The door to the bridge was sealed shut, but Dex's nimble fingers worked their magic, bypassing the security protocols. The door slid open, revealing the darkened interior. We stepped inside, the silence wrapping around us like a shroud. The command deck was in shambles, consoles smashed, wires hanging like entrails from the ceiling. But there, in the center of the room, was a console that still seemed to be operational. "Over here," I called, moving towards it. Dex joined me, his eyes scanning the screen. "It's a mess," he muttered, "but I think I can pull up the logs." Gregor and Lila stood guard, their eyes fixed on the doorway. Time was running out, and we all knew it. Dex's fingers moved over the keyboard, and after a tense moment, the screen came to life. "What is it?" Gregor asked, his voice tight. Dex's face paled as he read the data. "It's worse than we thought," he said. "This virus, it wasn't an accident. It was created here, on the Ark. I tried to process what this meant. Someone had unleashed this horror intentionally, and now we were trapped in their twisted experiment. We need to find out who did this," I said, my voice trembling with anger and fear. "And we need to stop them." "Agreed," Gregor said, his jaw set. "But first, we need to survive." Dex kept working the console. His face was pale, a mask of concentration and fear. Gregor watched the doorway, muscles tensed, ready to spring into action. Lila sat on a broken chair, her hands gripping her knees so tightly her knuckles turned white. I could hear her breaths, shallow and rapid. "Anything?" I asked, my voice low. Dex shook his head. "Still combing through the data. There's a lot here. They kept detailed records." Gregor snorted. "Of course they did! They wanted to see how well their little experiment worked." "Can you find out who did this?" Lila's voice was barely above a whisper. She didn't look up. "I'm trying," Dex replied. "But this isn't straightforward. They buried the information deep." A loud crash came from somewhere down the hall. We all tensed, eyes wide. Gregor motioned for silence, his finger to his lips. We listened, straining to hear any sign of movement. The ship creaked and groaned, the sounds of metal under stress. "We can't stay here much longer," Gregor said. "They'll find us." Dex cursed under his breath, frustration evident in his every movement. "I just need a little more time." "You might not get it," I warned. "Be ready to move." As if on cue, a scream pierced the air. It was close, too close. My heart pounded in my chest and I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. "Finish up, Dex," Gregor hissed. "Now!" Dex's fingers flew faster. "Got it!" he finally exclaimed. "There's a name! Dr. Adrian Crone. He was the lead scientist on this project." "Where is he?" Gregor demanded. "According to the logs, he had a lab in the lower decks. But that was before everything went to hell." "Then that's where we go," I said. "We find him, and we make him fix this." Lila stood, her legs shaky. "What if he's already dead? Or worse?" "Then we find his research," I replied. "There has to be something we can use." We moved quickly, Dex leading the way with the directions he'd pulled from the console. The corridors were dark, lit only by the occasional flash of emergency lights. We encountered more of the infected, their twisted bodies lurching towards us with mindless aggression. Gregor handled them, his knife flashing in the dim light. Blood splattered the walls, the floor, our clothes. The sounds of combat, wet and sickening, rang through the halls. We reached a hatch marked Research Labs. Dex worked the control panel and the door slid open. The air inside was colder, the smell of chemicals mingling with the unmistakable scent of death. The lab was a mess. Papers and equipment lay scattered across the floor, and the walls were lined with shattered glass. In the center of the room was a large containment unit, its thick glass cracked but intact. Inside, something moved. "Dr. Crone," I called out, stepping cautiously into the room. The figure inside the containment unit turned to face us. It was a man, or what was left of one. His skin was mottled, patches of raw flesh visible through rips in his lab coat. His eyes were wild, filled with a desperate intelligence. "Help me," he rasped, his voice a wet gurgle. "That's him," Dex said. "That's Crone." "Can you stop this?" Gregor demanded, stepping forward. Crone's eyes darted to him, then back to me. You don't understand. It's too late." "Like hell it is," Gregor snarled. "You made this mess. Now fix it." Crone shook his head weakly. "The virus. It evolves. I can't control it." "Then give us something," I urged. "A cure, a treatment, anything." Crone's eyes seemed to lose focus. "In my notes, the formula. But it's incomplete. You have to finish it." "Where are your notes?" Dex asked, already scanning the room. "Storage units," Crone whispered, pointing a shaking hand towards a row of cabinets. "But be careful. The others, they're close." As if on cue, a sound like nails on metal scraped through the corridor. The infected had found us. Gregor moved to block the door, his knife ready. "Get those notes," he ordered, "and hurry!" Dex and I scrambled to the cabinets, tearing through the contents. Papers flew everywhere, each one a potential lifeline. "Got it!" Dex shouted, holding up a bundle of papers. "Let's go!" We raced through the corridors, the infected on our heels. Their inhuman screams pierced the air, driving us forward. My lungs burned, every breath a struggle as the smell of rot and chemicals clawed at my throat. "Left!" Dex shouted, leading us down a narrow passage. The walls were slick with grime, the floor littered with broken equipment and discarded remnants of failed experiments. My boot slipped, but I pushed on. The bundle of Crone's notes clutched tightly in my hand. Gregor took the rear, his knife flashing out whenever an infected got too close. Each slash was precise, a dance of survival in this metallic hell. I could hear the wet crunch of bones and the thud of bodies hitting the floor. Lila stayed close to me, her eyes wide with fear. "Almost there!" Dex yelled, skidding to a stop at a heavy blast door. He punched the controls, fingers moving over the keypad. The door groaned, its mechanism sluggish from disuse. "Come on, come on!" The infected were almost upon us. I could see their twisted faces, eyes wild with hunger. Their bodies, once human, now mutated, moved with a horrifying speed and agility. Gregor held them off as best he could, but there were too many. "Now, Dex!" I screamed. With a final shudder, the door slid open and we barreled through. Gregor was last, diving past the threshold as Dex slammed the door shut. The infected threw themselves against the reinforced metal, their shrieks muffled. "That won't hold them for long," Gregor panted, wiping blood from his face. The room we'd entered was some kind of secure storage area, shelves lined with crates and containers. It was a temporary refuge, but it wouldn't last. We had to move quickly. Dex spread Crone's notes on a nearby table, his eyes scanning the pages. "Okay, we have the formula, but it's incomplete. We need to figure out the missing components." "And how do we do that?" Lila asked, her voice trembling. "We improvise," Dex replied. "Crone left some hints, but we'll need to experiment." "Experiment?" I snapped. "With what? We don't have a lab, and those things are right outside." "We find another lab," Dex said, determination hardening his features. "One that isn't compromised." Gregor grimaced. "That's a tall order, mate. Most of the labs are overrun or destroyed." "Then we make do," Dex insisted. "All right, let's find another lab," I said. "Gregor, you and I will scout ahead. Lila, stay with Dex and keep those notes safe." Lila opened her mouth to protest, but then closed it, her shoulders slumping in resignation. "Just be careful," she said. Gregor and I slipped back into the corridor, the sounds of the infected still audible through the ship. We had to find a way to complete Crone's work. We navigated the dark passages, the ship's creaks and groans a constant reminder of its fragile state. The infected were everywhere, their presence a constant fear at the back of my mind. We found another lab, smaller and less damaged than the last. The door was partially ajar, the room beyond shrouded in darkness. Gregor motioned for silence as we crept inside, our senses on high alert. The lab was in disarray, but the equipment seemed mostly intact. I could see workstations, chemical storage units, and various diagnostic tools. "We can work with this," I said, more to myself than to Gregor. "Let's get the others," he replied, turning to head back. Reuniting with Dex and Lila, we led them back to the new lab. Dex's eyes lit up at the sight of the equipment, and he immediately set to work. Lila assisted him, her medical training coming into play as they sorted through the notes and began preparing the necessary compounds. Gregor and I took turns standing guard, our weapons ready for any sign of trouble. Time slipped away as Dex and Lila worked. Every sound outside the door set my nerves on edge. Hours passed, and finally, Dex looked up from his work, a small vial of liquid held carefully in his hand. "This is it," he said, his voice filled with triumph and fear. "The antidote." "Are you sure?" Gregor asked, his eyes narrowing. Dex nodded. "As sure as I can be, but we need to test it." "On what?" I asked, already dreading the answer. Dex glanced at the door, then back at us. "On one of them." We all knew what that meant. We had to capture one of the infected, bring it back here, and inject it with the antidote. The plan was simple enough. Capture an infected, bring it back to the lab, and inject it with the antidote. Simple, but not easy. The infected moved in packs, and each encounter was a gamble with death. We had no idea if the antidote would work, and even less idea of how we'd contain a potentially raging mutant in the cramped quarters of the Ark. Gregor took the lead as we retraced our steps, moving cautiously through the ship's corridors. His eyes were sharp, scanning every corner for signs of movement. The smell of decay was stronger now, mingling with the ever-present smell of metal and burnt wiring. Lila, carrying the antidote in a secure container, stayed close to Dex, who carried a net and a stun rod. I brought up the rear, my heart pounding in my chest. We found our target in a corridor just outside the lab, where we'd initially encountered Dr. Crone. The infected creature was hunched over, gnawing on the remains of a fallen survivor. Its skin was a mess of lesions and open sores, muscles twitching under the surface. As we approached, the creature lifted its head, eyes locking onto us with hunger and rage. Gregor moved first, his knife flashing as he distracted the creature. It charged at him, its movements erratic and violent. Dex and I circled around, the stun rod crackling with energy. Gregor sidestepped a swipe, and I moved in, jabbing the rod into the creature's side. It convulsed, a scream tearing from its throat as the electricity coursed through its body. "Now!" I shouted, and Dex threw the net over the creature, entangling it in the mesh. We wrestled it to the ground, the infected thrashing and snapping, its teeth gnashing inches from my face. I could smell its breath, a putrid mix of decay and blood. Lila stepped forward, the antidote ready in her hands. Her face was set in grim determination as she plunged the syringe into the creature's neck. It screamed again, a sound that made my skin crawl. We held it down, watching as the liquid flowed into its bloodstream. The seconds ticked by, until finally, the creature's struggles began to slow. "It's working," Lila whispered, more to herself than to us. The creature's breathing grew labored, its eyes rolling back in its head. For a moment, it lay still, and I dared to hope that we had succeeded. But then its body convulsed violently, the muscles twitching and spasming uncontrollably. Its skin seemed to ripple, the lesions growing darker, more pronounced. "Get back!" Dex shouted, pulling Lila away. The infected let out a final tortured scream before collapsing into a heap. We stood there, breathing heavily. The antidote had done something, but whether it had cured or killed, we couldn't be sure. We'll take it back to the lab, Gregor said. See if we can learn anything from the body. We worked quickly, securing the creature's corpse and hauling it back to the lab. Back in the lab, Dex and Lila set to work. Gregor and I stood guard, the tension between us unspoken but understood. We were running out of time. Hours passed, marked only by the constant noise of the lab equipment and the occasional groan of the ship's infrastructure. Dex examined the infected tissue, his eyes scanning the data on the monitors. "It's not a complete cure," he finally said, his voice heavy with fatigue. "But it's a start. The antidote slowed the progression of the infection, but it didn't eliminate it." "What does that mean for us?" Gregor asked, his voice edged with frustration. "It means we need more time," Dex replied. "Time to refine the formula, to find the missing components. We need to figure out why the antidote isn't working as it should." "We'll keep searching," I said, my voice steady. "We'll find the components. We'll complete the formula. Whatever it takes." We were all on edge, nerves frayed from the constant tension. Dex and Lila pored over the notes and samples, trying to piece together a more effective formula. Gregor and I stood guard, our eyes scanning the corridor outside. My muscles ached from the recent fight, and every noise made my heart skip a beat. I glanced at Gregor, his jaw set in determination, his knife never leaving his hand. "We'll need more supplies," Dex finally said, not looking up from his work. "Some of the components are missing or degraded. We'll need to find replacements." I sighed, feeling the weight of his words. "Where do we start?" "There's an old storage area a few decks down," Dex replied. "It was supposed to be off-limits, but I heard rumors about it. Might be our best bet." "Rumors?" Gregor grunted. "Great. More wandering around in the dark." "We don't have a choice," I said. "We need those supplies." Lila looked up, her eyes tired but resolute. "I'll stay here and keep working with what we have, see if I can make any progress." Gregor nodded. "All right, let's get this over with." We armed ourselves with knives and a few salvaged pistols with limited ammo. The corridor outside was silent. We moved quickly, our footsteps muffled on the metal floor. As we rounded a corner, a figure stumbled into view. At first, I thought it was one of the infected, but as it drew closer, I saw it was a man, his face gaunt and eyes hollow. He was clutching a piece of metal, using it as a crude weapon. "Help me!" he croaked, his voice raw. "They're everywhere!" Gregor stepped forward, his knife at the ready. "Who are you? What happened?" The man collapsed to his knees, trembling. "My name's Reed. I was part of a scavenging crew. We got separated. They're all dead. The infected. They're down there. Hundreds of them." My stomach churned at his words. "We need to get to the storage area. Do you know a way?" Reed nodded weakly. "I can show you. But we have to be careful. They're hunting us." We helped him to his feet, his body shaking with every step. The corridors grew darker, and the walls were covered in scratches and dried blood, remnants of past struggles. The further we went, the more my skin crawled. Finally, we reached the storage area. Reed hesitated, his grip tightening on the piece of metal. "They're in there," he whispered. "Waiting." Gregor took the lead, his knife held low. I followed, my senses straining to detect any movement. The storage area was vast, shelves stacked with crates and containers. We moved cautiously, scanning the room for any sign of the infected. I could hear Reed's breathing behind me, each exhale a reminder of how fragile our situation was. "There," Dex whispered, pointing to a row of crates. "Those look like what we need." As we reached the crates, a growl rumbled from the shadows. My blood turned to ice. "They know we're here," Gregor muttered, his eyes darting around the room. The infected emerged from the darkness, their twisted forms moving with unsettling speed. We fought back, our knives and guns flashing in the dim light. Blood and gore splattered the walls, the stench of death overwhelming. One of the infected jumped at me, its teeth gnashing inches from my face. I drove my knife into its chest, feeling the crunch of bone and the spurt of warm blood. "We need to move!" Dex shouted, grabbing the supplies. We backed towards the door, fighting off the onslaught. Reed stumbled, his weapon slipping from his grasp. I reached out, pulling him to his feet, but an infected grabbed him, dragging him down. His screams were cut short as they tore into him, blood spraying across the floor. "Come on, we're almost there!" I yelled, forcing myself to move. We burst through the door, slamming it shut behind us. The infected pounded against the metal, their screams filling the corridor. We ran, the supplies clutched tightly in our arms. Back in the lab, Lila's eyes widened at the sight of us. "Did you get them?" Dex nodded, dumping the supplies onto the table. "We got them. Now let's finish this." Lila and Dex worked, their hands moving swiftly over the equipment, mixing chemicals and analyzing the infected tissue. The lab felt like a sanctuary amidst the chaos, but the screams of the infected outside kept us tethered to the harsh reality. I leaned against the wall, catching my breath, my muscles still twitching from the adrenaline. Reed's death weighed on me, and his screams lingered in my mind. "We need to stay sharp," Gregor muttered, his eyes scanning the room. "They'll break through eventually." "I know," I replied, my voice hoarse. "But we need time. We have to give them a chance to finish the antidote." Gregor grunted in agreement, his gaze hardening. "I'll keep watch. You get some rest. You look like hell." I managed a weak smile. "Thanks. You're not looking too great yourself." He chuckled, a sound devoid of humor. "None of us are." I slid down the wall, sitting with my back against the cold metal. My body ached, and exhaustion pulled at my consciousness. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to gather my thoughts. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their contorted faces, heard their growls. The virus had turned them into monsters, but they were still human once. Finally, Dex straightened up, holding a small vial of clear liquid. "This is it," he said, his voice trembling with exhaustion. "The antidote." "We need to test it," Lila said. "We need to be sure." I glanced at the door, the pounding a grim soundtrack to our desperation. "We'll need another infected," I said, my stomach sinking at the thought. Gregor nodded. "I'll go with you. We'll bring one back." It didn't take long to find another target. A lone infected staggered through the corridor, its movements jerky. Gregor and I moved in tandem, our knives flashing in the dim light. We incapacitated it quickly, binding its limbs and dragging it back to the lab. The creature struggled, its eyes wild with rage. Lila injected the antidote, her hands steady despite the tension. We watched as the liquid entered its bloodstream. At first, nothing happened. The infected thrashed and growled, its muscles straining against the bonds. Then, slowly, its movements began to calm. The wild look in its eyes faded, replaced by confusion and fear. The lesions on its skin started to heal, the raw flesh knitting back together. "It's working," Dex whispered, his eyes wide with astonishment. "It's actually working!" Lila kept her gaze on the infected, her expression unreadable. "We need to observe it. Make sure it's stable." "We don't have time for that," Gregor said, his voice sharp. "We need to produce more, and fast. The others are still out there, and they won't wait." I nodded, my thoughts in a frenzy. "We'll need to find a way to distribute it, and we need to figure out how to protect ourselves while we do." The infected subject lay motionless on the table, the antidote working its way through its corrupted veins. Dex and Lila monitored its vitals, their expressions a mix of hope and wariness. Gregor and I prepared for the next phase, distributing the antidote across the ship. We had no idea how many survivors were left, if any. "Start making as many doses as you can," I told Dex. "We'll need enough to cover a lot of ground." He nodded, already focused on replicating the formula. Lila worked beside him. Gregor and I suited up, checking our weapons and gear. The darkness beyond the lab felt more oppressive now. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. "We'll split up," Gregor said. "Cover more ground that way." "Agreed," I replied. "We meet back here in 2 hours. If one of us doesn't make it..." Gregor's eyes met mine, understanding passing between us. We'll finish the job, whatever it takes. We stepped into the corridor, the door hissing shut behind us. I headed towards the lower decks while Gregor took the upper levels. I moved cautiously, my gun at the ready. The infected were everywhere. I avoided direct confrontations when I could, but sometimes I had no choice. I encountered a group of survivors huddled in a storage room. They flinched as I approached, fear etched into their features. "I have something that can help," I said, holding up a vial of the antidote. One of them, a woman with a scar running down her cheek, stepped forward. "How do we know this isn't some kind of trick?" "You don't," I admitted. "But if we don't try, we die anyway." She hesitated, then agreed. "Do it." I administered the antidote, watching as the tension in their bodies eased slightly. "Stay here and stay quiet," I instructed. "We're trying to get more of this to others. Help will come." Leaving them behind, I continued my search. The further I went, the more the ship felt like a tomb. Bodies littered the corridors, their lifeless eyes staring into the void. The next group I found wasn't so lucky. The infected had already torn through them. I moved quickly, not wanting to linger in the blood-soaked hall. An hour passed, and I was nearing the end of my route when I heard a familiar voice. Gregor was shouting, his voice strained with effort. I broke into a run, my pulse pounding in my ears. The scene I found was chaos. Gregor was surrounded, his knife flashing as he fought off the infected. His face was a mask of pain. "Gregor!" I shouted, raising my gun. He turned, his eyes locking onto mine. "Get out of here! It's too late!" "No!" I fired, taking down one of the creatures. "We're in this together!" The infected swarmed him, and I watched in horror as they dragged him down. His screams were cut short, replaced by the sounds of tearing flesh. My vision blurred with tears, but I kept firing, clearing a path to his body. When I reached him, it was too late. He was gone. I retrieved what I could and stumbled back to the lab. Lila and Dex looked up as I entered, their faces pale. "Where's Gregor?" Lila asked. "He didn't make it," I said, my voice breaking. The room fell silent. Dex swallowed hard, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "We'll honor him," he said quietly, "by finishing what we started." We processed and prepared more doses of the antidote. It wouldn't turn back those too far gone. It could only help the survivors who were still human. We needed to ensure it reached them before it was too late. "We need to take the antidote ourselves," Dex said, not looking up from his work. "We've been exposed too many times." Lila and I nodded. She prepared 3 doses, and we each injected ourselves without hesitation. The liquid was cold and sharp, a visceral reminder of the thin line we walked between life and death. "We should check on Dr. Crone," Lila said. "He might have more information we need." Dr. Crone had been our key to understanding the virus, but the chances of him still being human were slim. We decided to check on him, leaving the safety of our lab. We navigated the dark corridors, the ship groaning under the strain of its own weight. We reached Crone's lab, the heavy door barely holding back the stench of decay. We forced it open, the metallic creak sounding through the empty hall. Inside, the cold air hit us like a wall, and I saw the familiar glass enclosure where we had left him. His figure was slumped against the glass, motionless. Through the cracked glass, I could see Crone's figure slumped in a corner. His once sharp eyes were now clouded, his skin a sickly grey mottled with dark patches. He twitched occasionally, a sign of the virus's progression. "It's too late," Dex said. "He's gone." Lila's face hardened. "We need to be sure. He might have left something behind." I braced myself as I stepped into the containment unit. Crone's eyes moved towards me, a growl rumbling from his throat. He was no longer the brilliant scientist. He was just another victim of the virus. "I'm sorry," I muttered, raising my gun. A single shot ended his suffering, the sound traveling through the lab. I felt a wave of nausea, but there was no time to dwell on it. "We'll need to split up again," I said. "Cover more ground. Dex, you stay and produce more doses. Lila and I will handle the distribution." Lila and I gathered the prepared doses, securing them in our packs. The door to the lab shuddered under the force of the infected's assault. We took a deep breath, steeling ourselves for the fight ahead. As we stepped into the corridor, the infected surged towards us. We fought our way through, knives and guns flashing. We moved quickly, finding small pockets of survivors and administering the antidote. Their reactions varied from relief to skepticism, but there was no time to convince them. We left the doses and instructions, urging them to stay hidden and quiet. The infected seemed to be everywhere, their numbers growing with each passing moment. We turned a corner and a group of them rushed us. Lila fought, her knife slicing through flesh and bone. But there were too many. "Get back!" she shouted, pushing me away as an infected grabbed her arm. She twisted, driving her knife into its neck, but another one jumped at her, teeth sinking into her shoulder. "No!" I screamed, firing my gun and taking down the attackers. But it was too late. Lila collapsed, blood pouring from the wound. I choked back a sob, but I couldn't stop now. I pushed on, determined to complete our mission. The survivors needed the antidote, and I would not let their sacrifices be in vain. When I finally returned to the lab, Dex's face was a mirror of my own exhaustion and sorrow. "Lila?" he asked. "She's gone," I said, my voice breaking. The silence in the lab was suffocating. Dex and I worked mechanically, producing the last doses of the antidote. The screams and growls of the infected had faded, replaced by an eerie quiet. We had administered the antidote to those we could find, but it wasn't enough. Some were too far gone, their humanity lost to the virus. Dex slumped in his chair. "It's not enough," he muttered, staring at the remaining vials. "We've done everything we could, but it's not enough." I placed a hand on his shoulder. "We did what we could. Now we have to see if it makes a difference." We left the lab, the corridors now hauntingly silent. In the infirmary, a few survivors lay on cots, their eyes hollow but alive. They clung to life, their bodies battling the remnants of the virus. The antidote had worked on them, buying them time. But how much, we didn't know. "We need to get off this ship," I said, my voice flat. "Find somewhere we can actually survive." Dex nodded, his eyes distant. "But where? We're floating in space with no destination, no hope of finding a habitable planet." We made our way to the bridge, the ship's control center now a graveyard of shattered consoles and broken dreams. I activated the navigation systems, scanning the endless void for any sign of a potential refuge. "Anything?" Dex asked. I shook my head. "Nothing yet. We'll have to keep scanning, keep searching." The ship shuddered, the engines groaning under the strain. We had limited supplies and even less hope. But we had to keep moving, had to believe that somewhere out there, a new beginning awaited. Weeks passed as we drifted through the vast emptiness. The survivors we had saved clung to life. One by one, some of the survivors succumbed, their bodies too weak to fight any longer. We did what we could to ease their passing, but it felt like a hollow gesture. Dex and I spent countless hours on the bridge, scanning for any sign of a habitable planet. The silence between us was heavy, filled with unspoken fears and shared sorrow. One day, the scanner beeped, a faint signal cutting through the static. My heart leapt as I adjusted the controls, honing in on the source. A small planet appeared on the screen, its surface covered in green and blue, a possible haven. "Dex!" I called. "I think we found something." He rushed to my side, his eyes widening as he saw the screen. "Is it real?" "We'll find out soon enough," I said, setting a course for the planet. "Prepare the survivors. We're going to need all the help we can get." The ship was barely holding together as we approached the unknown world. As we descended through the atmosphere, the ship's hull groaned, and the controls sparked and sputtered. But we held on, driven by the hope that this planet might be our salvation. We landed with a jarring thud, the ship settling on the surface with a final shuddering sigh. The air outside was breathable, the sky a brilliant blue. We opened the hatch, stepping onto the new world with cautious optimism. The survivors followed, their eyes wide with wonder and fear. "We start here," I said, my voice firm. We rebuild. We survive. The planet was an unknown frontier, filled with its own dangers and challenges. But it was also a chance for redemption, a chance to start anew. The night closed in around us, cold and unforgiving. We set up camp, surrounded by darkness. The hope of a new beginning felt fragile, almost illusory. We had escaped one nightmare only to face another, the bleakness of our reality inescapable. In the end, survival felt like a hollow victory. The universe had taken everything from us, leaving only the barest thread of existence. We were alive, but in the vast emptiness of space, that seemed a small consolation. The darkness was always there, waiting,